Good morning, everyone. I am Jim Johnson, the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and it is truly my honor to welcome you to the 7th Annual International Humanitarian Dialogues. I think that you only have to open the newspaper, or perhaps open up CNN, or whatever your preferred site is when you go to look at the news in the morning. And certainly in the headlines on every day right now will be what's going on in the Middle East. Whether you're looking at Egypt, Syria, Libya, or anywhere throughout the Middle East. And that's what makes this year's theme for the international dialogues so appropriate. The long, hot summer after the Arab Spring, accountability and the rule of law. And so it is truly our pleasure to open the dialogues this morning. I would very much like to start out by welcoming our very special guests and the prosecutors for the modern international criminal law tribunals. And actually, I'm going to start on my left in the front row right here with Serge Bramitz from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Next to Serge is Professor David Crane, the first prosecutor for the Special Court of Sierra Leone. Next we have Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor for the permanent tribunal, the International Criminal Court. We have Hassan Jallow, the prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. We have Brenda Hollis, the prosecutor for the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And next to Brenda, we have Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who was the third prosecutor for the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Before I ask you to recognize them with some applause, I would like to mention a couple other names here. First of all, on your program, you will see William Kaming, prosecutor from Nuremberg. Bill very much wanted to be here with us and was going to be here with us right up until a few days ago, and then we just decided that it would be best and the trip would have been a little much. And so unfortunately Bill could not be here with us, but he certainly is here with us in spirit and sends his best to everybody. I would also like to recognize Anna Harris. Where are you, Anna? There we are, right up there, the wife of Whitney Harris, a Nuremberg prosecutor. So please, join me in a round of applause for our prosecutors. We are so blessed to be able to hold the international dialogues here at Chautauqua Institution. The Robert H. Jackson Center is very, very fortunate to have a great friendship with the Chautauqua Institution, and they honor us in many ways throughout the season by allowing us to have some programming here on the institution, both in the season and of course now. And so with that, I would like to welcome the president of Chautauqua Institution to say hello and welcome you.
Thank you, Jim, and Greg, and all of the people from the Jackson Center. Welcome to the prosecutors. We so admire your life work, appreciate the difficulty of all of that, and welcome you to a place that celebrates that work, its disciplines, and also its consequences. Welcome everyone else to Fletcher Hall and to this institution. Some of you I know have been here through this season. Last night we ceremonially concluded the 140th season of Chautauqua Institution by tapping a gavel 3 times and officially closing, and you now open. And I would suggest that some of it is very much the same dedication of values. We often come at these kinds of issues in very different sorts of ways. Indeed, that's what we try to do, cross disciplines, get people to think in different ways, and think about the richness of life through its many, many, many layers. I was thinking about Rwanda during the introductions. In 1993, the first Chautauqua lecture was given by Roger Rosenblatt, who's an essayist and now a memoirist and poet and on and on and on. Anyway, he came on the subject of why I write, and I've never forgotten one of the images that he talks about. He was standing on a bridge in Rwanda, and he was looking down at the river as it flowed in a rather heavy current below him, and there were bodies from the genocide that were in the river, and he was watching, and some of the bodies would float below the surface, and then they'd come to the surface, and it was just this very dramatic scene in the river. And he said, I thought about evil and how evil is with us all the time, and some of the time it's below the surface, and other time it's very much apparent in our lives. I've thought of that image often, and I think of it in particular when I think of the work of these good people, the acknowledgement that it's there, and the importance that we as a global society establish laws that demonstrate without hesitation that it's unacceptable and that there are consequences. And I thank you for your work. I thank all of you good people for taking the time to reflect on this very important body of work. And I hope you enjoy the time you spend on these blessed grounds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Thomas Becker. Okay, before we move into the next part of the program, I do want to just take a moment to thank our sponsors for this, because of course, without our sponsors, we could indeed not hold this program. And so we very much appreciate the generous support that we receive from our sponsors. You will meet many of them throughout the program the next couple of days as they are involved in the program, but I would just like to name their organizations at this particular time, and then you'll get to meet them more personally later. Of course, we have the American Red Cross, the American Bar Association, the American Society of International Law, the Athenaeum Hotel, Case Western Reserve University School of Law, Chautauqua Institution, the Enough Project, Impunity Watch, Syracuse Law School, the International Bar Association, International Law Girls, New York University, Planethood Foundation, Washington University and St. Louis School of Law, and in association with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So please give a round of applause for our sponsors. It's at this time that I would like to introduce our presenters for the next phase of our program. And so I would like to welcome to the podium, first of all, Andrew Biter, who is the co-director of the Robert H. Jackson Center Educational Initiatives, and Alexandra Sandez, who is the editor-in-chief of Impunity Watch.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and nice to see so many faces from last night's program. In addition to being education director at the Jackson Center with my colleague Joe Karb, I have the privilege of being the director for the Summer Institute for Human Rights and Genocide Studies here in Buffalo, which is a 5-day program now going on for 6 years for younger students in high school to learn more about the issues that we're looking at today. For the prosecutors in the front seat, it's an honor to be with you today. And when you look at the back, there's roughly 15 students wearing I Am Malala t-shirts. And the good news is that reinforcements are there for the next generation. And here to talk about the Summer Institute and the essay contest with Impunity Watch is my colleague and co-director, Laurie Raybould.
Thanks, Drew. I'd like to just briefly tell you a little bit about our program, and some of you may have picked up our handout on the front table on your way in for further information and for our website. Thanks to Drew's inspiration about 7 years ago and to the vision and generosity of the Jackson Center, this program has been able to bring young people together from all over Western New York to study the Holocaust and other genocides, as well as human rights violations around the world. Every summer, we bring together survivors, teachers, lawyers, experts in the fields that we are studying. And a big shout out to David Crane, who's been with us every year of our program, and also to Fatou Bensouda, who's been with us the last couple of years. Thank you. You inspire us. And we have the goal of learning from the past to make a difference in our future. We absolutely believe that education is the key to putting an end to violence, discrimination, and terror around the world. And every year we study local, national, and international problems, and we discuss how we can help make a difference in our world and put an end to suffering. This year, students learned about farming labor laws and migrant worker legislation in New York State from a youth artist group from New York City. We revisited the atrocities of the Rwandan genocide and studied the ways in which that nation is rebuilding itself. We listened to Jamel Bateb, who was the online catalyst through Facebook for the Arab Spring in Tunisia, and he's here today as well. Students Skyped with Shabana, the founder of a girls' school in Afghanistan, and with a former ABC News reporter and founder of Syria Deeply, Lars Zatrakian. We all also celebrated Malala's birthday with her and watched as she bravely spoke before the UN about the worldwide need for more access to girls' education. In addition, our students are very passionate activists and often go on to do some profound things in their community and in their schools and in their futures. Many have gone on to study international law, and recently we've had a few intern with the International Rescue Committee and the Peace Corps. Additionally, for the last couple of years, the Syracuse University School of Law's Impunity Watch has encouraged our students to articulate their beliefs by offering an essay contest. Here today we have the current editor of Impunity Watch, Alexander Sandus, to tell you a little bit more about that program and about this year's winner. Thank you.
Good morning. As just stated, I'm Alexandra Sandus, and I'm a third-year law student at Syracuse University College of Law, and I'm the editor-in-chief of this year's Syracuse University Impunity Watch Law Journal. Impunity Watch Law Journal at Syracuse is an interactive website that operates both as a law review and news reporting site. It was created through the efforts of our dedicated group of students and Professor Crane, and the founding chief prosecutor of the Special Court of Sierra Leone. The goal of our website is to immediately alert the world of impunity issues as they arise and to provide open access to thoughtful, cutting-edge academic debate about the issues of impunity. We work to provide unbiased, objective reporting on impunity issues, and we aim to expose and examine human rights and impunity issues from grassroots and academic perspectives. We collaborate with institutions to further our mission, and one of those collaborations is with the Summer Institute for Human Rights and Genocide Studies. Our connection helps to foster the next generation of students and of human rights-focused thinkers and actors. Lastly, the Summer Institute, and along with Impunity Watch, aim to inspire young men and women to make a difference in the world. Now, I am proud to announce, on behalf of Impunity Watch and Professor Crane, the winner of this year's essay contest, who is Kayla McCall from Lancaster Central High School.
Well, good morning again, and what a great beginning of a great moment every year when we sit and pause and consider important issues related to the work that we have done or are doing related to atrocity, international criminal law, and just the rights of human beings to live in peace. So welcome again. We had a great event last night at the Robert H. Jackson Center and a great reception there, and I think the beginning of a great comedy team. I won't go too much into that, but it was amazing. And so we're just thrilled to look out in the audience and to, oh, thanks. Oh my goodness, this is very interesting. We received this morning a cable from the Swedish embassy that our distinguished keynote speaker has been made a honorary citizen of the country of Sweden, and his new name is His Royal Highness Prince Zederson. That's a lot funnier if you were there last night. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce a colleague, a friend, a mentor, and frankly for me an inspiration, someone who has operated from the horrors of Yugoslavia to the halls of the United Nations and around the world. His Royal Highness Prince Ziyad Zid El Hussein is the ambassador and permanent representative of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to the United Nations. He has been in various senior ambassadorial roles at the UN for 6.5 years. He's also was the Jordanian ambassador to the United States as well. But more importantly, he is an activist and someone who leads from the front. This is not just a diplomat who looks out the window going, I wonder what we can do into the world. He's been there, he's been on the ground, he has smelled death, he has got his fingers dirty, he knows the horrors of a world without the rule of law. And for that, I deeply respect him for that, and that carries a great deal of credibility because he is an expert in international criminal law. He was the first president of the Assembly of State Parties of the International Criminal Court, and he helped shape the elements of the various crimes of the Rome Statute as well. And I got to know him very well at many instances, but one of which was the hard work, the years of hard work of coming up with a definition of the crime of aggression, which culminated in Kampala. He also is a leader within the UN. He is looked to by various senior members of the diplomatic community, the Secretary General, to look at, report on many issues related to things that are affecting the United Nations and mankind. Just as an example, and I mean I had a 3-ring binder of the things that this distinguished gentleman and friend has done, but in the spring of 2005 he produced a report on the alleged sexual abuse and exportation committed by UN peacekeepers, a very controversial report because it's a very sensitive topic, of course, which provided for the first time a comprehensive strategy for the elimination of sexual exploitation and abuse in UN peacekeeping operations. Later that year, in September of 2005, 191 heads of state and government fully endorsed that report. And this is just an example of the type of leadership that this distinguished gentleman and friend has done. He was educated at Johns Hopkins University and has a PhD from Cambridge University. He serves also on numerous boards. He's a prolific writer, but I think the one thing and the most important title that he does have is dad and father. He's a family man. He's married with 2 wonderful children. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and pleasure of introducing His Royal Highness Prince Ziyad Zid El Hussein, the Ambassador of Jordan to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, David, for that warm welcome. Good morning, everyone. David called me 6 months ago, and he said, Zaid? And I said, yes. See, I knew he wanted something. you see, your friends only know you too well because they're laughing about it. He said, Jade, you've been living in the US for some time now, haven't you? And I said, yes. And he said, part of the time you've spent in the US was in Washington. Yes, that's correct. And he said, and presumably while you were there, you spent time looking at the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the various amendments. And I said, yes. And he said, then so you support free speech? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, good, because you'll be giving one on the 26th of August at Chautauqua. So here it is, a free speech. The reflections and disjointed impressions of an ordinary professional diplomat at the UN speaking in a personal capacity, and that's for the benefit of the two cameras here, about the Arab Spring and accountability. And of course, this is a difficult task for anybody. When you look at the 5 countries most affected by the Arab Spring, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, each contains within it so many moving parts, we almost don't have enough mental power to crunch and understand everything that's happening within each country, let alone then trying to delve deeply into these situations. And so I will shun description this morning in favor of broad reflections and impressions. And there are very many other very distinguished colleagues within the audience from those very countries who are much better placed than I am over the next 2 days to provide you with all the details. What a relief. Okay. The first reflection that I'd like to impart or present to you is the conventional narrative fixed on the background to the Arab Spring. And the narrative is basically extrapolated from the 4 UNDP-inspired Arab development reports, Arab human development reports, which hold in sum that deficits in knowledge, freedom, and good governance, in effect, placed the Arab world, the region we describe as the Middle East and North Africa, in a basket labeled utter failure. And when reading the 4 reports, we agree with their conclusions. One has to. And yet, what is most interesting is that when compared to other regions and focusing exclusively on rule of law indices only, the MENA region does not fare so badly, notwithstanding whatever anecdotal and UNDP presented evidence would have us believe. According to the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index 2012-2013, out of the 97 countries surveyed in detail, along 7 indices, the first being limited government powers, the second being the absence of corruption, the third, order and security, the fourth, fundamental rights, the fifth, open government, the sixth, regulatory enforcement, the seventh, civil and criminal justice. The Middle East comes after Western Europe and North America, and after East Asia and the Pacific, but, and this is the crucial point, ahead of Sub-Saharan Africa, ahead of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, ahead of Latin America, and ahead of South Asia. So while the enormous upheavals shaking the Arab world must find root in pre-existing rule of law fissures, in addition to all of the other non-rule of law related areas or causes, such as high food prices, economic mismanagement, poor quality of education, humiliation. These fissures on their own would not be enough to explain and account for the dramatic events unfurling before us now. In other words, the rule of law deficits on their own cannot account for all of what we see, because in other areas, in other geographic areas of the world, they're far more pronounced, and we haven't seen anything akin to the developments we've seen with the Arab Spring. The second impression that I'd like to share with you is an impression I gleaned from a visit to Jordan last week, and I returned only at the end of last week. I was there for practically 5 days and held a continuous series of discussions. And then, as we are now, we felt that we were being whipped daily by a new staggering development. Today we heard, for instance, that the experts that were sent by the UN now to look at the site of the alleged chemical weapons attack were shot at by snipers and have been withdrawn temporarily or not, we don't know, and we're waiting to see. And the gigantic developments in Egypt and the indisputable fact, with only culpability remaining to be determined, that chemical agents have been used in Syria on a large scale, I think dominated our thinking last week. And what I found most interesting and most extraordinary about the events in Egypt to begin with was how they were viewed by notable Jordanian human rights and legal experts. I had arrived in Jordan believing and knowing that the people whom I was going to see, while they would have no time for the Muslim Brotherhood, would nevertheless have equally been appalled by the enormous bloodletting that accrued following the clampdown or the cracking down by the Egyptian government on the Muslim Brotherhood. And to my astonishment, it was really quite the opposite. These very people, activists, lawyers who devoted themselves to human rights issues, not just within Jordan, but also within the region, were very supportive of what the government was doing, notwithstanding the massive loss of life. And their view was, and they said to me, this, that the Brotherhood in Egypt was leading that country and the region into a very dark future where human rights and civil liberties were concerned, and that the Egyptian people, broadly speaking, knew it, and with the help of the army, checked this development. To give you some illustration of what this position maintains, I found this on the internet, written by an Egyptian wit, and I quote. He writes, "A lot of my dear American friends still ask me what on earth really happened in Egypt. For their benefit, and anyone else on earth genuinely trying to make heads or tails of us crazy Egyptians, here's exactly what happened in Egypt over the last 12 months, but expressed in American terms. There are no exaggerations or lies. These events all took place." On the 30th of June 2012, he writes, "Democratically elected Barack Obama wins the second round of an election with 51.7%. In the first round, he only got 25%. He takes the oath and is sworn in as President of the United States. First 5 months of his term go relatively smoothly, where he makes almost no decisions, except for some dubious presidential pardons to a dozen convicted terrorists and murderers, including some convicted for their part in the assassination of a former US president. Then suddenly on the 21st of November 2012, President Obama issues a presidential decree giving himself sweeping powers to the extent that his future decrees become uncontestable in any court. In effect, his decisions henceforth are akin to the Word of God, his laws a new Bible. Nationwide protests erupt as a result of his decree, and 1.5 million people organize a sit-in at the White House to peacefully request he rescind it. Some of Obama's Democratic Party supporters attack the peaceful sit-in outside the White House with guns, shoot 5 peaceful protesters dead, and a few weeks later, President Obama dissolves the US Supreme Court and labels them all traitors to America. One short week later, he fires the United States Attorney General and personally appoints a Democrat to replace him. A month later, he annuls the US Constitution and forms a constitutional committee to draft a new constitution, and in parentheses he writes, "Committee includes no Republicans or independents, no Muslims or Jews, and only a handful of women, and is composed primarily of Democrats and religious preachers." In a referendum not supervised by any judicial branch, this constitution narrowly wins, and President Obama ratifies it the very next morning, despite it having gotten the approval of 18% of all Americans. Within a month, he invites top global terrorists, known jihadists, and al-Qaeda members from all over the world to a rally in Yankee Stadium, where he cuts ties and declares wars on Canada. Throughout this whole time, the US economy is sinking, the stock market collapsing, foreign investment has all but stopped, tourism has died, electricity, fuel, and water shortages are a daily occurrence. Unemployment has almost doubled, the US dollar has lost 20% of its value. Democratically elected President Obama has done this all in his very first year in office. Ultimately, on the 30th of June 2013, 110 million Americans take to the streets in 50 states, peacefully and politely demanding for 4 straight days that democratically elected Obama leave immediately and not continue his remaining 3 years. That is it in a nutshell. Now, this view, expressed by a young Egyptian, found some resonance in the writings of a Syrian friend of mine, a Syrian friend of my family's, I should say, who last week wrote this to us, and it sort of completes the impression that was just read out. And he said this, he said, if the German army, the Wehrmacht, had overthrown Hitler as Chancellor on the 1st of March 1933, a few days after the Reichstag fire, and wherein blood to have been spilt, it would have drawn the wrath of all true Democrats. And yet, knowing now what subsequently ensued, perhaps it would nonetheless have been the right thing to do. Now, I wouldn't equate the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, with the Nazi Party, but what I want to convey to you is the complexities of these very situations and the very moral dilemmas with which we have to face. And it's never that easy to just draw arbitrary lines across these issues. The third reflection is one concerning Syria. It's actually very difficult to talk about Syria because, of course, things are moving very quickly now there. All of us, most of us, seek accountability for the appalling crimes that have occurred in Syria over the last 3 years, or 2 years, I should say. And you reach a point where you can no longer stand watching YouTube simply because the uncensored images that are placed on it are just, they fill you with utter revulsion. And so how could we not but demand accountability for what has happened there? And yet, Syria strategically, of course, is in a very sensitive spot. While many of us would desire at some stage that the Syrian situation be referred to the International Criminal Court, thus far the Russians the Chinese and some other countries have not been in favor of this. The US has been very much in favor of there being accountability for these crimes at the stage to be determined in the future. But with the Israeli presence and occupation of the Golan, there's a complication because any referral by the Security Council of Syria, of the ICC, or let's say Syria to the jurisdiction of the ICC, then would drag that situation also in, and for obvious reasons the US would not be in favor of that. But this is still a script that is unfolding, and we must view it very carefully. The fourth reflection concerns developments in Libya and in Yemen. As all of you are well aware, Libya and the International Criminal Court have been in a deep discussion over admissibility and over the surrender of the two suspects that have been, for whom arrest warrants have been issued, Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi and Abdullah Sanusi. And the court ruled in July that the two for whom arrest warrants have been issued must be surrendered to the court, and I understand an appeal is still in progress, and that the appeals chamber of the ICC must now decide on this. In the case of Yemen, we have not seen what we expected to see, and that is that there be accountability for the former head of state. He was granted an amnesty as the price for his departure, and although the amnesty, of course, carries weight in Yemen, and there is there are two Security Council resolutions endorsing it, ultimately it's questionable whether other courts have to abide by this should he set foot in other countries. I think what these two examples show, though, is that we really need to be very careful here. And many of us have been very passionate supporters of the earliest intervention by courts into events where a tremendous amount of blood has been spilled. I think we have to revisit this. Not that we in any way degrade our support for the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but we need to develop a sort of more nuanced feel. When I recently examined the German example, what was striking to me was not Konrad Adenauer's insistence that the German approach to accountability. So as you remember, you had Nuremberg, which was an international trial. Then you had a series of trials that were managed and run by the separate Allied armies. The US had the 12 subsequent trials at Nuremberg, and then you had the Dachau trials principally. And the Allies themselves, the Soviets, the British, ran their own trials, and the Poles had trials as well. And so early on, when the Allied armies removed themselves by and large from at least West Germany, it was time for the West Germans to now begin to deal with this, and Adenauer was not in favor of an early address. He felt that the German people, although he himself had nothing but revulsion for what the Nazis had done, he felt that the German people needed to address the issues of starvation, lack of resources, and the horrors that they themselves faced from 1945 to 1947. What was interesting to me is that the Attorney General of the state of Hessen, Fritz Bauer, who then assembled the first large case on Auschwitz that was managed by the Germans, the Auschwitz-Frankfurt trial, himself was not in favor of a rapid movement in that direction, which is quite unusual because normally it's the prosecutors and attorney generals who would be absolutely gung-ho, and the political leadership at the top would be saying, no, slow down. But in the case of Germany, the feeling was that they too needed space. There was the trial of the Einsatzgruppen A, which was a completion of the work conducted by Ben Ferencz, who's been here a number of times, in Nuremberg at one of the major trials in the subsequent period following the IMT. And so you had the trial, and then you had Auschwitz. And in that case, of course, Bauer was willing to go along with Adenauer. And of course, the German economic miracle began to emerge in the same way that following the US Civil War, Lincoln was not insistent that there be a redress in terms of the culpabilities over the crimes that were committed during the Civil War. And a pattern, of course, has emerged. Now, when we began, of course, many years ago, and Professor Sharif Bassiouni was one of the fathers and architects of the International Criminal Court, along with Ben Ferencz and many others. When these discussions began, there was a deep-seated feeling that any justice delayed is justice denied. And so perhaps we then recalibrated it to say that at the earliest possible juncture, we must address these issues. And I still believe it essentially to be true, but I think we need to make slight modifications and establish a mental bridge between ourselves and the very people with whom we need to help. The other thing that has occurred to me recently is that we focus all too often on just ending impunity, and that alone is a hard enough task with inconsistent cooperation on the part of member states. So what we have striven to do is essentially punish those who have been guilty over the commission of the most appalling crimes. And yet, what is astonishing is that when you look at all the trials that were conducted post-Second World War, run by the Allies, the Poles, the Soviets, and so forth, there's hardly a single case of remorse or contrition expressed by the perpetrators. Albert Speer was the only one who said anything at the IMT, at the main trial. And then you look further, well, you had Rudolf Höss, when he was convicted by the Poles. I mean, there was plenty of contrition following his conviction, but no one believed what he said, not least Primo Levi. Here was a man who accounted for the most savage killing in one spot. And how could you believe a mass killer when he says, "I'm sorry," unless it's accompanied by something else? And nothing in his actions, or when you look at subsequently the behavior of his family, his children, his wife, would lend you to think that somehow he was truly honest in his expressions of remorse. And so you then look further, and who else has expressed remorse? There's the very interesting case of Franz Stangl, who was the commandant both of Sobibor and Treblinka, and the second commandant of Treblinka. And during his entire trial, he held to superior orders that he was ordered to do this, and it was his duty to oversee the death of anywhere between 700,000 to 1.3 million people in Treblinka. The most amazing thing is that the superior orders defense was more or less demolished in Ulm in 1958 when a German researcher established that no senior or no SS officer was ever punished for not obeying orders, or at least the punishment was very light. And in Auschwitz, there were a few cases where this happened, and everyone knew that the SS orderly or officer concerned was not punished. And so there was room for maneuver here. In any case, Franz Stangl, he held to this defense in 1970-71, and then he was interviewed by this remarkable journalist. And in the final interview, there were 4 interviews that she had with him, and in the final interview, she brought him to within a hairbreadth of a full admission of guilt, something that was not achievable in the context of a trial, but something that she got very close to. And I think this is the missing piece in the practice of international criminal law. It's no good punishing people who to their dying breath, or their last breath, or to their last day, believe that they're innocent, notwithstanding the overwhelming weight of evidence presented before them in a trial which points to the contrary. And so we must find a way not to replace what we have, but to extend it. So it's not just punishing these people, but then finding a way, and perhaps it's not a judicial process, but it is something that psychiatrists have to help us with, and we have to exhaust all the appeals, which are infinite almost. But we need to take them to this point where they recognize their wrongdoing. Otherwise, what happens? Otherwise, their supporters within the broader community will themselves sort of continue to deny the depth and the gravity and the depravity of the crimes that were once committed. And this is what happens when you look at the former Yugoslavia. It's amazing to see. I mean, we had one case where a senior Bosnian Serb leader basically expressed remorse, and the judges decided to reduce her sentence. There were reports, I'm not sure if they've been confirmed, and perhaps Serge Brammertz can tell us, but there were reports that once she returned to Banja Luka, she gave an interview and basically said that her expression of remorse was a device ensured to, or thought up so that there would be a reduction of sentence. But was it genuine? Certainly it didn't appear from the interview that she had. So we need now, I think, our profession needs to think very deeply of how we move this forward, but not at the expense of what we've already tried to achieve. And perhaps with all the people here, we could advance this. But again, it requires a subtlety, and it requires of thinking, and it requires a nuanced approach to all these new situations that will present themselves. Because ultimately, it's not just a case of punishing the person. We must know why they have committed the crimes in the first place. And it's not a case of just presenting a historical narrative, but what is it about the psychology, the psychological makeup of this human being that allows them to do the unimaginable in many cases? And that at least should bind all of us in a common endeavor, because most of these people who kill are not pathological, are not sort of pathologically driven to do it in one way. They're not sadists. They're not people who have a long record of illness in any direction. They're normal people who would do this. And as I said, in many cases, the circumstances are not such, at least in the case of many Nazi officers, they were not such that they had no other choice but to commit these crimes. They could have avoided it if they wanted to. In sum, when looking at the Arab world, accountability, yes, is something that is very important. That we need to be very critical in the way we approach it, yes, absolutely. We must also understand, and this is my final point, that when you look at the Arab world, and this perhaps is an idea of where we're going in the future, there is no authentic Arab liberal philosophy, or no authentic Arab liberal philosopher at the moment. I mean, in an age of iPads and iPhones and galaxies and so forth, there are hardly any philosophers anywhere, let alone the Arab world. But in the Arab world, the importance is here. If you don't have an authentic Arab liberal philosophy upon which you can build liberal or Arab liberal political parties, what you have in default is the Islamic ideologies which are authentic to the region. And if we are to escape the charge that whenever you invoke Jean-Jacques Rousseau or the social contract or Montesquieu, or you could invoke almost any Western liberal philosopher, the charge from the Islamic, those who peddle the Islamic ideologies, would be that these are imported Western ideas. afkar mustawrada, as we'd say in Arabic. And in the absence of a genuine drive from within to articulate something else beyond the market, but a social philosophy that works for us, because as you know, the Ba'ath has been discredited both in Iraq and now in Syria, it's on its back legs, then we are basically striving, hoping for, there's a mimicry basically that exists, that people want to be like something else, they want to be like the West, but they just don't have the grammar, the tools to articulate it and to fashion it into a political platform. And so for a long period of time to come, we are going to see this rather jerky movement forwards and backwards between aspirations and the aspirations of a, by and large, liberal youth, juxtaposed to Islamic ideologies that have strong foundations, a good organizational structure, and are indigenous to the region. And I think that will be the narrative for the period to come. And where accountability fits into this is something that we will have to see how it develops in detail. So, I thank you very much. I didn't have too many jokes at the end, so I tried to keep it serious. Otherwise, you'd think I'm only a comedian. So, thank you very much.
Would you like to? Okay, well, stay. We do have time for just a very, very few questions. We only have about 5 minutes or so, but we do have a little time, so please.
Yeah. Shall we volunteer someone?
We have one way up at the top.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the question. I think you may be overcomplicating the issue, because it's not true to say there was no liberal Arab tradition. There was in the form of the Ba'ath when it started out. There was a strong socialist Arab tradition, but that basically fell apart first, I mean, for a variety of reasons. We saw what happened in Iraq in the late 60s and early 70s, from 68 onward. And since then, the socialist tradition in the Arab world has been on the decline. And of course, post the end of communism in the Soviet Empire, it's almost collapsed in many countries. In its place, though, there hasn't been anything to fill in the void. And so on the right, you have, what do you have? You have the Islamic ideologies, and you have, and I should be clear here that I'm not speaking about traditional Islam. I'm speaking about the ideologies that the Islamists themselves would advocate. And you have the market, and you have the Islamic ideologies, and on the left, you really don't have very much. And so, if you look at what Islam, or what you purport is Islam represents, I think you have to discriminate between, are you talking, the 8 schools of jurisprudence, there are the 2 Shia schools, you have also the Salafi doctrine, and then you have the Takfiri sort of thinking at the extreme end of the Salafi doctrine, which is Al-Qaeda, it's the Taliban, it's everything else that we face. Now, if you're going to speak of Islam, I think you need to identify to what ideology are you addressing, are you making or addressing your point too, because it's not all the same. And so here I think we have to be extremely careful. The other point is that we just had a meeting of 100 Islamic scholars in Jordan. And it was whether and to what extent Islam fits with the modern world, and to what extent is it amenable. And there was a broad consensus by all of them, and this is led by some very notable scholars from Al-Azhar University, that essentially the Sharia, and I really feel that I shouldn't be saying this because we have Professor Sharif Bassiouni who is much more knowledgeable. The Sharia provides the broad principles which we cannot contradict, but it doesn't go into the detail of modern life. And so long as we then fashion the detail in conformity with the broad principles, we are okay. And on many issues, that are often cited, because these are issues that the extreme end of the Salafi movement, or perhaps in Iran you'll find some of the ulama speak of it, shouldn't dictate the overall narrative about where Islam fits into the modern world. But these are tensions which are often not purely within the domain of religion, because in every country you have people who don't want to see their way of life change markedly in any direction. No? And then you have those who are the traders, those who are the business people, those who want to exchange commodities, those who want to trade. Globalization began when the first trader turned up in a village, possibly in the Bronze Age, or even in maybe the Iron Age after that. And then said, I want to trade with you. And then there was a discussion in that village, should we deal with an alien who could pervert our way of life, or should we try and benefit from understanding what that trader wants to bring? And so many of these issues then fall into that domain as well. Sorry, it's a very long response to your question. Yes, sir.
Wondering about the Muslim Brotherhood, as you stated, the dangers of their taking power and where they were headed, but now that they've been brutally put down, how do you bring buying back to that huge population that supported them? Can they be convinced, the danger of what their leaders did, or is that going to be impossible? And in that case, how will reconciliation or harmony be possible in society?
My good friend, I may be a funny guy, but I'm not a prophet to know. I'm not a prophet to know. What I was conveying to you was a sentiment which I was surprised by. I myself was not, I was completely shocked by it, really, because I thought the view would have been what we've seen happen now is really awful. I mean, very much or aligned with the Western view of developments in Egypt. And what I was so surprised with, that there was this alternative view that, as they said, so dark appeared the trajectory that Egypt was on, that something had to be done, and nothing short of this sort of shock action could have arrested it. Now, clearly, I think everyone hopes that wisdom prevails in Egypt, and that a deep dialogue and accommodation can be reached for Egypt to work its way out of the problems it has. And the fundamental problem it has now is its economy, and that has to be rescued. The currency is under threat, and I think foreign investment has all but dried up. We heard reports of capital flight out. It's too important a country. It's it is the pivotal country in the region, and it just cannot see any further decline in its stability. Yeah. One last one. He had his hand up.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Abdullah. I'm from Syria, but my question is more about Egypt, actually. I heard you saying the lack of real liberal values and principles in the Middle East that's making this problem. My claim myself to be a real liberal, but when I see majority of liberals in the Middle East follow Saudi Arabia model and supporting the army crackdown and peaceful protesters, the majority of peaceful protesters in Egypt, I really support your claim about the lack of liberal values here. And my question to you is the problem with the values of the society, or the problem with the people who claim themselves being liberal, because they are liberal as long as there's no Islamic government, even if this Islamic government can by election?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, Akhi Muhammad, you need to start rising, basically. And we need liberals to start rising and to articulate a vision of liberal thinking that is very much attuned with traditional Islam. I mean, it's not at a divergence. And we need to couch it in Arabic, in Arab terms. Again, if we try to mimic ourselves along a Western model, we're in a weak position, because the moment you sit there with our colleagues from the other ideologies, they will just dismiss us very quickly. So we need to find the right formula where we can basically all exist cohesively together and with everyone around us. I think that's the form. Thank you very much.
Well, I certainly cannot think of a better way to start our dialogues, and that was simply magnificent. Thank you very much. Maybe a few things that the prosecutors could comment on in the next session with regard to remorse of those that have been convicted and what you've seen. But anyway, two very short announcements before we take our breaks. First of all, as the popularity of the dialogues has grown, and you just have to look around this auditorium to see that, I have just been informed that the extra seats for lunch and dinner today have been sold out. But if you want to join us tomorrow, you need to let them know over at the hotel so that we can see if there are any available seats for breakfast and lunch tomorrow at the hotel. Otherwise, there are restrooms at the Lene Hall next door, and please be back in your seats so we can start promptly at 10:30. Thank you very much.